We're up to Yudalit Amid Beis. Now, we're about two-thirds down the daf, but before we get into that, what I'd like to do a quick oral review of several points from last week that are very germane to our going forward. If you recall, the main subject of our discussion, well, there's a couple things, but there is a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel in the situation, and you can follow along, but it's in the I think 4 or 5 lines down. We're talking about a gazlan, someone who robs a property. Either he steals a deed or whatever it happens to be, and he makes himself the owner, and people don't know, and he sells it to someone else. Then it's discovered. So as a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, what can be collected from the gazlan. So Rav says yesh lo mos yesh lo shevach, that the aggrieved party who bought it can collect his money and his improvements that he made on the property. He made improvements. And Shmuel says that he can only collect the property, but not the improvements. And Rashi says on Shmuel, shevach ein lo lekamen meforish tama, later in the Gemara, and today hopefully we'll get to that later, we'll explain Shmuel's reason. But that's the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Then the Gemara goes on and the Gemara tries to understand what's Shmuel's reasoning. And they ask the kasha, if the seller specifically indemnified the buyer and said, I will give you, if something happens or you lose the field, I will give you the value of the improvements, is that okay? And it turns out the answer according to Shmuel is no. But in saying no, the Gemara introduces a subject which is really a key subject for us, and that is that when a gazlan transfers property, sells property, he doesn't own the property. So the money that is paid for the property isn't really for the property, because the property isn't his. It's as if he's making a loan to the gazlan. The nigzal is making a loan to the gazlan, and therefore, when he has to repay, what does he repay? He has to repay the keren, the actual property. If he returns the shevach, it appears to be ribis. That's what we discussed last week. Why does it appear to be ribis? Because he's getting a property for $1,000 and it's returning $1,100. Why? Because the shvach is $100. That $100 in the course of a loan is ribis. Now, David asked a good question. Is it really ribis? Because the Gemara says, chazei ribis. It looks like ribis. So the answer is, and hopefully we'll get to that Gemara today that talks exactly about that, but the answer is it appears to be ribis, and therefore it's forbidden. You're not allowed to do it, according to Shmuel.
Excuse me, Rabbi, excuse me?
Yeah.
Michael just signed in, Michael Horowitz. He usually has some refuah shlemos. If we can take a break a second.
Yeah, Michael, you okay?
You're muted, Michael.
I'm so sorry. I'm late. So Meir ben Liba.
Meir ben Liba.
Yerachmiel Moshe ben Rachel.
Yerachmiel Moshe ben Rachel.
Sora Bas Esther.
Sora Bas Esther.
Marissa Bas Tobi.
Marissa Bas Tobi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So we're just saying now. So that's the reason, according to Shmuel, is because it appears to be ribis, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. Okay. That was the main introduction to our Gemara. Then the Gemara just wound up asking several other questions and quoted a Mishnah. This Mishnah is important. There's a Mishnah in Gittin that says, "A matzil lachilas peres." You can't repay if someone ate the fruit of the field or improved the field, or the field was obligated through the ksuba for a wife and her daughter. You cannot collect. You can only collect those from bnei chora, not from menachoshem mishubadim, because of something called tikkun olam. And we explained tikkun olam to mean that if you're returning the field and you know the value of the field, okay. But if someone is going to buy and then be potentially subject to having to pay for the improvements of the field or fruits that were eaten or all kinds of things, you're going to chill commerce because everybody who buys a piece of land is going to say, wait a minute, I know I'm obligated for the land. Okay, if the land is my obligation, that I recognize. But you're going to tell me that I'm obligated for an unlimited amount of produce or field of improvements or other things, that I'm not going to accept. So the Gemara, so there's a tikkun olam that we cap the potential return that the lokeach who buys this property has to pay only to the property itself and not to anything else. And that's a Mishnah, which we're going to have a discussion about. Okay, then the final thing we talked about was understanding this Mishnah, and the Gemara goes back and forth and says, what is the Mishnah talking about? If it's talking about Gezel, we have of a Gazlan, we have the problem of ribis. If it's a Balchov, because they wanted to introduce the fact that maybe it was a Balchov who took the property and not a Gazlan, in other words, a creditor. And the Gemara answers, Hakadi Isa v'Hakadi Isa, that the two parts of that Mishnah, one is speaking about a Gazlan and one is speaking about a creditor, a Balchov. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop, just quickly, of what we're going to talk about today, is this whole subject of whether or not, if you improve the property and you have to pay improvements, does it look like ribis? Because ribis is forbidden in the Torah, and if you're paying in return on a halva, on a loan, more than you got, that's ribis. That's ribis. In its rough sense, that's called ribis. Now,
how is the property, the buildings on the property, were they conveyed? Or, I mean, if a guy has a house on a property and he sells a property, but he rents the house, and does that mean that he gets the rent or the buyer gets the rent?
Well, our situation is not talking about improvements. It just so happens that in this Gemara really focused on the land and farming the land. So we're not really talking about if he has a house or other things on it which produces rent.
Well, isn't the new owner allowed to do the farming and reap the harvest?
Well, that's exactly what he does. But since it's stolen property, it's going to go back to the original owner. And so he says, wait a minute, I just invested money in fertilizer and my own sweat, and I improved the land and I have produce and it cost me $500. Who's paying me that $500? So that's the subject of the discussion. If that $500 has to be paid by the Gazlan, then it will appear to be ribis, interest, because the underlying principle is that what he got was a loan, not the property, because the Gazlan doesn't have ownership of the land. So when the buyer gave him the money, he didn't give him the money as a purchase, he gave him the money as a loan, says Rashi. In other words, the karka can't be conveyed, it's stolen. So he paid him and he gave him a loan, and in return, he gave him the property sort of as collateral. He worked the property. Now he's losing the property because the real owner says, wait a minute, this guy forged my signature on a deed. I want my property back. He has to give him the property back. But then the buyer goes to the Gazlan and says, wait a minute, you cheated me. So now you have to give me another property. Okay, and the Gemara says, you can do that. But what about my profit? What about what I did on the land? So Shmuel says, not so fast. You can't give him the profit because that looks like interest, because the whole thing was a loan, not a purchase. So that's our situation. As far as improvements on the land, if there was a house or other things, a whole different story. I mean, maybe we can address that another time, but that's not what we're addressing today. We're only addressing the improvements that the buyer made to that stolen land and how you treat the improvements. So the Mishnah over there in Gittin said that certain things cannot be collected from the Chosam Mishabadim, from pledged property, such as fruits that grow or improvements. Let's say he fertilized it. He doesn't have to grow anything. He fertilized the land, he put around a fence. Those are all improvements. Those have value, and he wants to collect for that value. So the Mishnah there says those things cannot be collected from the Chosam Mishabadim, from pledged property, because of Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam means that we're worried that if you're going to be able to go and collect from that person for everything that was done, and it's an unknown, because the land, you know, but the improvements, there could be hundreds or thousands of dollars of improvements. How are you going to possibly evaluate that and say, now you owe that money. So we say no. Then you can only go to the Goslin and get it from unencumbered properties, meaning if the Goslin owned other property that's under his name, you can go to him and collect for that property, but not from the Chasam Mishabadim. Then the Gemara asked, but that looks like Ribis. So therefore the Gemara wanted to give an answer. Okay, so we're not talking about a Goslin, we're talking about a creditor. And with a creditor, it's a whole different story. It doesn't apply. So the Gemara ended that sugya about 2/3 down, and it says, Ha-kedi-isa v'ha-kedi-isa. In other words, part of that Mishnah can be talking about a Goslin, and part can be talking about a creditor, and therefore we're going to avoid the question of Ribis. That's how the Gemara answered last week, and so that we're up to now v'holo tana hacha. It's the last 4 or 5 lines, and I'd say it's about maybe 20 lines from the bottom. V'holo tana hacha at the end of the line. So now the Gemara is going to ask a question, and is going to want to bring a raya from a brisa, not like what we just said. Remember, the underlying principle here is whether or not Shmuel finds the case to be ribis or not. That's what we're really looking for. In other words, not every case is ribis, but when the Gemara wants to say we're talking about a Goslin, then that's a ribis situation. When the Gemara talks about Balchov, it's a non-ribis situation because with a creditor, you don't have ribis. Okay, so that says the Gemara like this. Well, we have a brisa that's not like that. What does the brisa say? L'shevach kakors ketzad. What is the meaning in that Mishnah when the Mishnah says that for shevach, for improvement of land, you cannot collect from only from Chasam Mishabadim, not from Bnei Chorim. L'shevach kakors ketzad. Here's the situation. One person forges the documents and he steals the land. Now, this language of the Gemara is a little bit cryptic. It's taken from his hand. So whose hand? What's taken? So let's take a look at Rashi. So Rashi tells us, but Brisa, Allah the Hachnis Nissen, the Brisa of this Mishnah, the Emetzian, the Tukma Babal Chov, right? You want to answer. It's speaking about a Baal Chov, and therefore there's no kasha on Shmuel for Ribis, because in a situation of Baal Chov, there is no Ribis, right? That's what you want to interpret. Take a look. Bezdin Motzian Oso Miyado. Bezdin takes it from his hand. In other words, it becomes known that this is a stolen property. Bezdin interjects and takes it from the hand of the Goslin. That's what the Brisa means to say. So when the Nigzal, the person from whom it was stolen, collects, Govas HaKeren in the Chasam Mishubadim, he collects the Keren from the Chasam Mishubadim, meaning if the robber then sold property that he owned, that property you can collect from. But the shevach, the improvements, those you can only collect from unencumbered property that the Goslin owns. Unencumbered property the Goslin owns. Okay. So now
we say what page are we on? What page are we on again?
We're up to Yudalit Amid Beis. Yudalit Amid Beis. Down 2/3 down on the page. So the Gemara says, "Hey Chedam, if you say it's like we just said, that what? That the Bezdin takes it out of the hand of the Goslin, Goslin Mangavi. Who's the Goslin going to collect from? The Bezdin did the right thing. Someone complained, the owner, let's say, complained. They immediately took it from the hand of the Goslin. What does it mean he collects? The Goslin doesn't collect from anybody. The Goslin, we got it back, and that's it. So what does it mean when the Gemara says that V'gova, right? V'gova min, who's he collecting? The Goslin's not allowed to collect from anybody. Says the Gemara, no, that's not what the Gemara means, that you take it from the Goslin. He already sold it to someone else. And that lokeach, that buyer, improves it. So now, so now the situation is that he sold it to someone else. So when the Gemara says, when it tells us they're taking it from the buyer, not from the Goslin. Important difference. The way the Mishnah reads, in its simplicity, it seems that the Goslin sells it, the Bezdin intervenes and takes it from the hands of the Goslin. That's what it seems to mean in the Brisa. Correct the Gemara. If that's what it means in the Brisa, what do you mean they collect? What do you mean he collects? Who does he collect from? The Goslin was just thwarted from his efforts, and the case is over. Elamai, you have to interpret the Brisa to mean not that the Bezdin takes it from the Goslin. The Goslin forges the signature, sells the property to a buyer, and Bezdin gets wind of it and goes to the buyer and says, wait a minute, you bought stolen property, we're returning it to the rightful owner. So they intervened after the sale. Now it makes sense when they say Begova, who's going to collect? The buyer who's out this property is going to go and collect from the Goslin, from the thief. Okay, that makes sense. Amalei, lav terutza komiteretes.
Excuse me, Rabbi, but the buyer has no insurance here because the Goslin that he goes back to collect, he's bankrupt, right?
Okay, you're right.
So we're not protecting the eventual buyer here who innocently bought stolen material.
You're correct. If that Goslin is totally bereft of everything, you're right, then the Lokeach is out of luck. The circumstance that the Gemara is positing is where the Goslin did have other property. The question is, what did he do with that property? So the Goslin sold some of his property and kept some of his own property. So the Gemara comes to tell us that the property that he sold, right, it's called Nechosim Mishabadim, that the buyer is allowed to collect from the unsuspecting buyer. The unsuspecting buyer, he's allowed to collect the keren. In other words, $1,000 for the property, $1,000. What happens if he improvement? That you cannot collect from the Lokeach. Why? Going back to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah teach us? The Mishnah said that under circumstance where somebody bought property, that he's protected because of Tikkun Olam, he's protected from having to repay Peirus, Shvach, Ksuba, all those things that normally you're allowed to get. He's protected because then if he's not protected, then for all he knows, he'll be buying a piece of property for $1,000 and owe $5,000 because all the improvements and the Ksuba and all those things will multiply, and that poor buyer is going to be saddled with everything. Says the Gemara, Tikkun Olam, you can only collect the value of the property, the $1,000, but the other amount that's owed, you can only go back to the Goslin and collect it from property that he never sold.
So the Bezdin, well, why doesn't the Bezdin take a stronger hand when an unsuspecting buyer? Because the Bezdin got interfered when you didn't go 3 steps, and if they found out, it would stop the transaction earlier.
If they stopped it earlier, they would have prevented all of this. The problem is they only found out about it after all of this had already happened.
But don't they? I would think that they would have a responsibility to make it straight with the innocent buyer. You know, the third chain here. Somehow they would go to the Goslin and directly take the property from him, not require the innocent buyer to go backwards and try and get the money out of other people.
Okay. So the innocent buyer has the force of Bezdin behind him. You're right. The Bezdin is going to issue an edict it's as if the Bezdin issues an edict and it's a command of Bezdin. Let's not, I mean, they're not throwing the buyer to the wind. I don't want to give you that impression. The buyer can go back with the force of Bezdin, but only to collect the Keren.
Right.
The Bezdin cannot do more than help him collect the Keren.
Yeah,
When it comes to collecting the Shvach, which Shmuel says you can't collect, it's because you can't put the onus on that poor third buyer, the guy. In other words, you can't make him be responsible for something that happened on a piece of property that he innocently bought.
Right.
So that's what the Gemara is coming to protect. So the Gemara here says,
Rabbi Grauman,
yeah.
Before we go, is there a sort of fail-safe way that the buyers from like a, you know, that you can check these title searches, quote unquote, that you don't have to worry about a chance of possibility of purchasing stolen property, so you have that sort of repercussion, and then you can say, oh, I signed this document saying we checked everything is on the up and up, and there's no, but so you don't have to worry about these repercussions.
Okay, so again, today we have the luxury of having something centralized where you can check everything and find it. Then in the Gemara, the only thing that the Gemara that you can taina is that when a person sells a property, people know about it. In other words, yes, you can do your research and find out that Reuven sold Shimon that piece of property. Oh, wait a minute, that piece of property, how could Reuven have sold it? It belongs to Levi. So in other words, the word gets out by shtaris, right? Of course, not worldwide. In that community, the world gets
They don't
out.
live in a bubble, right? But yeah.
You live in a bubble. So we know that Reuven sold it to Shimon. Now, buyer beware. If Reuven sold it to Shimon, okay, now there is some kind of chain, sort of a written chain that we know. But we're going to see later in the Gemara, there's something called milva ba'al peh, that there is oral transactions that have no validity as far as a chain of knowledge, because they're oral. So when something is written, the onus is on you to search out and make sure there isn't something written. Now, remember, nothing was centralized, but you still have to have that kind of general feeling. So yeah, you're right on that. So now let's go back to the Gemara. So now, there's a kasha here. You're saying hi kid Isa. So what happened here? Hey chidami, ile mikediktoni gazlan memagave. If you're going to say that it was so the question is, are we talking about a gazlan or a balchov? Remember that the Gemara answered the kasha on Rav Nachman about ribis by saying that the case that seemed to be ribis was the case of a balchov, and the other case was the case of a gazlan. So balchov, there's no ribis. Says the Gemara here in this brisa, what are you going to talk about? You're talking about someone who stole a field, sold it to someone else, right? So, who's he going to collect from? And now you're making him repay. So if he repays, again, it's ribis. So the kasha here is that since you're not going to get away from the fact that there's going to be a ribis situation where you have a gazlan. You want to try to answer that it's a balchov, but that brisa there was talking about a gazlan, not a balchov. And if it's a gazlan, inevitably you're going to have ribis. So how do you get around of it? So he answers them very interesting on Malay, lav to karutzim komataretzes tarets nami balchov. So it's lahavdil. It's if, you know, I say lahavdil, you'll understand why. So the Gemara talks about a case of intervention by the Bezdin, right? Intervention by the Bezdin, l'chayra means that Bezdin intervened with the Gazlan. On the face of it, that's what it means. You want to reinterpret and said, no, it can't mean that because you don't protect the Gazlan. It has to mean a case where he sold it to somebody else. So the teretz here is that since you're changing the meaning of the brisa by saying that it's not where the Bezdin took it from the Gazlan, but they took it from the buyer, so therefore now we're going to say Rab Nachman, he says, if you have the license to change the meaning of the brisa, I have the license to change the meaning of the brisa and say it's speaking about a balchov and not a gazlan. The way I say lahavdil, it's like two kids are playing, and one of them changes the rules, and he says, "You change the rules, I'm going to change the rules. You change the rules because you say the brisa should be speaking about where the Bezdin took it from the Gazlan, but you changed it to mean he took it from the Lokeach, then I'm going to change the rules and say we're not speaking about a Gazlan, we're speaking about a Balchov. Why does he do that? Because he wants to not find a stira in Rab Nachman that it's ribbis. Remember, the underlying proposition here is we're trying to protect this situation from ribbis, because if it's ribbis, then the fellow who improved the land is out of luck. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want him to be shortchanged, like you asked, Jay. At the end of the day, he's an aggrieved party. If you're not going to allow him to collect, then you've done him a disservice, an avla. You've done him a disservice. So we're trying to find a way to interpret the Gemara that he can collect. How do we do that? By saying, oh, it wasn't the Gazlan, it was a Balchov. The Gemara's interpretation is that of a Balchov. He's a Balchov, not a Gazlan. If he's a Balchov, there's no ribbis. So that's how the Gemara wants to answer this kasha. No stira on Rab Nachman, because we're not talking about a Gazlan. We're talking about a Balchov. A Gazlan taka, you have a problem. But this situation isn't the equivalent of a Gazlan. It's the equivalent of a Balchov, of a creditor. And with a creditor, you don't have ribbis. So it's kind of a circuitous way of getting to help the buyer here, so he shouldn't be out of luck, by reinterpreting the Gemara and the Brisa. And why are we allowed to reinterpret? Because we already allowed it to be reinterpreted, because we took it away from where the Bezdin collects it from the Gazlan, which makes no sense, because what are you protecting the Gazlan for? By saying that they're protecting the buyer. Okay. So now we're at a point where we don't have a stira. All the Gemara from last week and continuing now is to avoid a stira, a kasha on Rab Nachman, that Rab Nachman who says that you cannot collect because of ribbis. And here we're going to find ways for him to collect, but make sure it's not ribbis. Because if we allow him to collect, it's going to look like ribbis, and that'll be a kasha on Rab Nachman. Right? That's the whole theory of the Gemara, is to protect Rab Nachman. That Rab Nachman is correct that in the case of a Gazlan, since he doesn't own the land, it's a halva. Therefore, repaying is ribbis. We want to keep that intact, and we want to say that all these other Gemaras that we're talking about are not that. So there's no stira. You're allowing him to collect, but it's not ribbis because it's something else. It's a balchov. We say he's a Balchov, so there's no kasha on Rab Nachman. So Rab Nachman can be true to his position that with a Gazlan, you cannot collect ribbis. So we're going to see that the Gemara is going to ask kashas on that. Okay, so Toshma. Comes the Gemara now. It says, Toshma, we learned from a Brisa, Achilas Peres Kate said. What is the situation of Achilas Peres? Harisha Gozel Sodom Mechavero. Go ahead.
You know the Shiur or something?
Yeah, we do. Okay. What's up?
Right.
No, I can
call you back.
Okay.
Okay.
A person stole the field from someone else. Okay, that's our situation, and it left his hand. So the principle you can collect from the Chosam Mishubadim, that's straightforward. But the payers you have to collect from Bnei Chorim. Says the Gemara, hey Chadami, is similar to our situation. If you're saying it's a Gazlan, then what do you mean? Why are we allowing the Gazlan to collect? Who should he collect from? He's the bad guy. So the Gemara wants to bring a raya from this brisa that, again, we have to be talking about a Balchov, because if we're talking about a Gazlan, then it's a stira to Rab Nachman. So the Gemara brings a raya from this brisa. So where we are right now is we're saying we can't be dealing with a situation of a Gazlan, because it's always going to come back on us that Gazlan is if we're protecting, if we can't say we're protecting the Goslin, so it has to be a third party, and a third party can never collect directly from the Goslin, from Chosim Mishabadim, because then it'll look like ribbis. So that's how we have to answer it. So now the Gemara is going to bring two other positions, two other situations to show us how we can distinguish Rab Nachman that it should not be ribbis. And the Gemara gives two interesting examples. Okay, the last of the, right before the wide lines on the bottom. Omar Rava, says Rava, Hocha b'maya skinen, you know what we're talking about? We're going to gozel soda mechavero, mole peros. The person forged, let's say, the documents, and he took that land and he sold it. What was on that land? The land was full of fruits. It had an orchard, it had oranges, and all kinds of things. But v'ochelas aperos, he ate the fruit himself. V'chofa boros sichen amaros, and then he dug ditches and he dug holes and he dug caves on the property. So he ruined the property. New situation. He ruined the property. Bo nigzel ligvos keren, the person from whom the property was taken comes to collect the keren. Says the Gemara, govim and chosim mishabadim. That he can collect. So now, what did the robber do? The robber wasn't a poor guy. He owned land. He took his land after he ate the peiros. After he ate the peiros, he sold other property that he owned to a third guy, to Levi. So now the aggrieved party, the Nigzal, can come and collect Menechosim Mishubadim from Levi. He can collect the value of the land, right? And Bo Nigzal Ligvos Peiros Gover Menechosim B'nei Chorin, but he can collect the Peiros from B'nei Chorin. Now, so the kasha is, why is this not ribis? The teretz is because in this particular situation, what is he collecting? He's not collecting over and above the value of his property. He's collecting to bring back the value of his property. Remember, this Goslin, not only did he just sell the property, but he devalued the property by digging ditches, by digging holes. So that which the Nigzal is collecting money to bring him up to the level of where he was before the property was stolen. So according to Rava, we're not talking about profit. We're talking about a Goslin, not a Balchov. If you're talking about a Goslin, then you have the problem of ribbis. So he says there's no ribbis here because he's just collecting to bring him up to the value of what he lost. That's not ribbis. So
making him whole.
To make him whole, correct. When you're making someone whole, that's not ribbis. So Rava is introducing a new scenario into our Gemara and saying, our Gemara isn't talking about a Goslin and Shevach Amperis like you think, which opens you up to ribbis. No, we're talking about a case where the Goslin ate the Peiros. The Goslin ate all the Peiros. Then he took the land, he dug it up, and now, in order to get back a valued piece of land, this fella has to collect the land and money to improve the land to where it was before. That's not ribbis. Okay, that's one teretz. So Rava is giving you a teretz of a scenario where you have a Goslin and it's not ribbis. Remember, we keep talking about a Goslin and every case is ribbis because he improved the land, he did this, he built a fence, whatever. Now he wants his money for the land. That appears to be ribbis. Why does it appear to be ribbis? Because the Goslin doesn't own the land. So we consider it to be a loan, and from a loan, you're not allowed to repay. Here, the repayment is not ribbis, it's to bring it, to make it whole. That's one teretz. Now, the very bottom line, Rabba bar Rabbi Huna Omer, up to the next daf, Tesvav of Amid Aleph, Rabba bar Rabbi Huna says, Kagon shenatlua masikin. Natlua Masikin is as follows, and this is from a Gemara in Bava Basra. The Gemara says over there that if government officials were looking to confiscate land, okay, they were on the hunt to confiscate land, and this fellow stole the land, okay, Reuben stole the land from Shimon, and he said to the officials, "You're looking for a piece of land? Here, take this land." So he's showing them land that he doesn't own, that he says to the officials, "You take this land." So what's pshat here? So he has to repay. This guy owes the land. Take a look at Rashi. Shentlu masikim anosim akum. The goyim anosim, they kidnapped it. They took it. Not lumin hagazlan umachmoso. The Tanam Bava Kama, not in Barabasa. Hagozel Sodim Mechavero. If someone steals a Sodim Mechavero, but not Lua Masikin, and these Masikin, these, in other words, these the third-party government people, Im Machmas Hagazlin, if it's because of the Gazlan, because he pointed it out, Chayv Lahamad Lo Sada Acher, he has to give the Nigzal, the one who stole it from, a different field. Baharayotza Metachas Yodo. So what's the pshat here? What is Rabbi Rav Huna telling? So now, so bo nigzal ligvos keren. So if in the Gemara, if the nigzal comes to take the keren because his property was kidnapped, govim menachosem mishabadim. Bo nigzal ligvos peres, govim menachosem b'nei chorin. Then he can connect from b'nei chorin. So okay. So if that's the case, then once again, we find a situation where you can collect, but here you're collecting from the property. It's not considered ribis. We don't even look at it as ribis because it's from the hands of a third party. In other words, the nigzal turned it over to a third party. You can't collect from that third party because that third party is the government, let's say. They're the ones who took the property improperly. So he can collect nechosim mishabadim from one party, and bo nigzal ligvos peres, and he can collect the peres from another party. And since in that circumstance we don't consider it the appearance of ribis, so therefore that's how Rabbah says the Gemara. Even with a gazlan, we have a situation where there would be no ribis involved, because in this particular case. He has to compensate him. He has to give him the value of the land and any payers that were lost. And we don't consider that ribis. So we have two terutzim that the Gemara gives, one from Rava and one from Rabbi Rav Huna, of circumstances where there is a gazlan and there's no ribis. Because remember, we keep saying that in the case of a gazlan, there's always ribis. We have to always move away from that. So here the Gemara gives us two scenarios from one from Rava, one from Rabba, where you have a gazlan, and there is no ribis. So now the Gemara asks Akasha. Okay, so that's how Rashi explains it.
But just for the record, the Sansino translates the Masikin as bandits. The Goyim are bandits, but at certain times in history, bandits and the government were the same thing.
Right, right. I think the Gemara there in Bava Kama talks it through and says that basically this guy was a moser, because they wanted to take the land. Maybe they were government bandits. I mean, they may have been government bandits who, under the guise of the government, whatever. But they wanted to steal some land, and this Ganef, this Gazlan, gave him the land. He said, "Take this land." In other words, he was the one who pointed out, says, "If you want to take a piece of land, take this land." He had no skin in the game because he stole it. So because of that, so that's the scenario where he gave them another piece of land. And again, so now the nigzal comes back. Look, if it would have plagued case of these robbers or government, whatever, taking a piece of land, who does the nigzal go to? The nigzal has no one to go to. Yeah, go to the robbers. The robbers aren't going to give you a nickel. I mean, they're going to, right? You can't go back to the kidnappers of the land, the robbers. So you have to go back to somebody because that person stole it from you. Says the Gemara, in this particular case, it's not ribis because he stole the land for a third person. Therefore, it's not the classic case of where because you improved it, you're going back to him to collect. You're going back to him to collect because of what he did to a third party. Says Rabbah, that's not ribbis. Under that circumstance, it's not ribbis. So here we have two situations where we're talking about a gazlan and there's no ribbis. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to explain why Rava and Rabbah have two different shitas and one doesn't hold like the other. Rava lo omaka Rabbah by Rav Huna, haru yatzis mitachas yado bedina mashma. Says Rashi, bedina mashma hilchach b'hotzos nigzel kama b'gover sekeren dekama kishetofa bo boros. In other words, Rava's situation is where the Bezdin can take it bedin from the person who stole it. So therefore, he can't hold like Rabbah because the Bezdin will have no, the situation is not where it was taken improperly. In other words, the Bezdin doesn't have reach to these government officials. So according to Rabbah, you can't have the situation of Rabbah where you're talking about third-party ganovim, corrupt individuals, because it's not bedina. It wasn't taken bedin, it was taken not bedin, right? It was taken not bedin. Rav Huna lo omaka Rava, and Rav Huna can't use Rava's scenario. Hariyotza v'tachas be'ina mashma. Be'ina mashma says Rashi k'moshe hoysa v'lo shechofa boboros. Rava's situation, again, he's not talking about depreciating the land through digging holes. He's talking about a case of a whole piece of property that was taken by a third party. So we're nuancing here. We're saying Rava can't hold like Rabbah because Rava is speaking about a case of Dina and where the Bezdin has the ability to take it. So digging holes in the property doesn't take it out of the hands of the Bezdin to take it. Therefore, he can't hold like Rabbah. Rabbah, who says we're talking about these masikin, so be'ina mashma. So he's saying, okay, it's masikin, but it means they took the property, not that they took a pockmarked piece of property that had holes and everything else. So Rava and Rava don't see eye to eye. Therefore, each one of them has to give a different teretz. But in each of their terutzim, there's no ribbis. That's really the key. They're giving you situations where even though you have a gazlan, it's outside the scope of ribbis. Rav Ashi Omar, comes Rav Ashi, and he says, wait a minute, I'm going to give you a third reason, and not like Rava, not like Rashi. And we're talking about the Tzedad and Ketani, two different people. What does it mean? In other words, the situation that we're talking about is the one that Rava actually brings down, but he doesn't emphasize this. A person stole the field of mole peros, he himself ate the fruit. So already he has converted the land, stolen the land, and eaten the fruit. And he sold the field. It's not pockmarked, it's not digging holes. He took the field and he sold the field minus the peros to a third person. Bo lokeach ligvos keren. So the lokeach, okay, who's the lokeach? The person who bought the land, right? Not the nigzal. The person who bought the land comes to collect the keren, govim and chosim mishabadim. That he can collect from the chosim mishabadim because he's entitled to it. Bo nigzal ligvos peros. Who is coming to collect the peros? The original owner who had peros on his land. The buyer never had peros on his land, because when the buyer bought it, it was minus peros. He just bought land. All he's entitled to is land. He's not entitled to peros. He's only entitled to land. The peros, who's entitled to? The nigzal, the one who owned it, who owned the stolen land. Bo nigzal ligvos peros. Govim and chosim ben echorim. So Rav Ashi says, you know why it's not ribbis? Because two different people are coming to collect. Remember, our case of ribbis is where one guy buys it, improves it, and comes back to the Gazlan and said, give me the land and give me the improvements. Says Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, that improvement looks like ribbis. Says Rav Ashi, that's not our case. Our case is two different people. One person claims the land. The other person can't claim the land because he's gotten the land back. He only claims the fruit. The fruit isn't ribis because there's no loan here. So according to Rav Ashi, so we have three terutzim, three different possibilities of gazlin and no ribis. Remember, the whole purpose of this whole sugya is to see how we can avoid the ribis issue. So now we have three, Rava, Rabba, and Rav Ashi, each giving us a different scenario where there's no ribis. Okay? So Ben Rava, Ben Rava. Okay, now, says the Gemara, we'll try to go a little bit weiter. Ben Rava, Ben Rabba, Baravuna, Milva al Pehu. Okay, we started with the question. I think, Jay, you asked the question. You asked the question of, isn't there a central, I mean, how do you, it should be documented, right? In other words, we should have some way of a person knowing if someone sold land. So here we're going to come to the understanding of what it means to document and not to document. So Rava and Rav Huna, Malva al Pehu, in both cases, remember, it's stolen land. Stolen land, you can't transact. When the person gave him money, he loaned him money. Just like that first Rashi said on Yudalad Amid Beis, that if a person, that in the case of stolen land, that so we consider this to be a loan. What kind of loan is this? Is this a loan with a shtar? No, it's a milva al peh, right? Because when a person sells the land to somebody else and that person does a chazaka, the loan has no shtar. It's basically a loan ba'al peh that we're treating it as a loan, right? Any shtar on the karka doesn't apply to the loan. So the loan is a loan ba'al peh. And we say milva al peh ein a goyim min achosim b'shabadim. That milva al peh ein a goyim min achosim b'shabadim. So this is a kasha on Rava and on Rabba. Rava and Rabba both give scenarios where someone steals the property, and in repaying the property itself, you can collect from the chosim b'shabadim, the improvements only from the chosim b'nei chorin, from property that the Gazlan did not sell. Wait a minute. We have a halacha that says milva al peh in a government the chosim b'shabadim, that on a milva al peh you cannot collect from the chosim b'shabadim. So how can, in Rava and Rabba's scenario, where they want to come and say that the situation here is where you want to collect the actual keren, that you can collect from the chosim b'shabadim. Only the improvements you have to collect from the chosim b'nei chorin. How can you collect from the chosim b'shabadim? These cases are treated like milva ba'al peh. They're treated like oral transactions, and oral transactions can only be collected from an chosim b'nei chorin. So the Gemara is now asking a kasha. Rava and Rabba wanted to interpret the Gemara to prevent the issue of ribis, and they did a good job. No ribis. But wait a minute. Not only is it not ribis, you can't even collect from the chosim b'shabadim because they are considered to be oral transactions, and oral transactions you can't collect. So let's look at Rashi. Ben l'Rava, the mukma gevias kerem min agazlan ben nigzel homalva al pehu v'lo torfa mishabadi. You can't collect from the chosim mishabadim because it's considered to be milva al peh. So both according to Rava and Rabba, who answer our Gemara correctly, we have a problem. In both cases, you want to be able to collect the keren from the chosim mishabadim, and you can't do it. So the Gemara answers as follows: Hocha b'mayaskinen kisha omed bedin for hodar zavin. That you went before Bezdin before it was stolen, before he sold it, and then he sold it. So the minute he stole it and you went before Bezdin, Bezdin can immediately remove the property, right? Immediately, says Rashi, Kishama Bedin, Kodem Shemochem Nechosov, before he sold the property, given the Chayve Bezdin, is lekola v'havalei kemilva b'shtar. Okay. So again, Jay, to your Jay Marcus, Jay, according to you, remember you asked about, well, don't people know? So here you see, Rashi is telling us that once Bezdin pronounced that in Bezdin it already has a call, it has an established voice that this property is owned by so and so. So the Gemara wants to split the situation and say that right away he went to Bezdin, and Bezdin announced, wait a minute, this property does not belong to the Goslin, and he can collect his property minachosim b'shabadim. And then v'hadazavin, all right? And then he sold it. And then he sold it. So now he sold it to some unsuspecting fellow who now wants to collect the nechosim, right? So in other words, from the time it was established in Bezdin, the scoundrel still was able to sell the property unsuspecting to a third party. And that third party can now only collect from the Chosim B'nei Chorin. Frank the Gemara, Yacha Peres Nami, Kishama Bedin, Peres Nami, then why can't you collect the Peres from the Chosim Mishubadim? Because the Peres should also be Omad Bedin, right? Kishama Bedin, al Karen below Omad Bedin, ala Peres.
But Rabbi, this also sounds like the Bezdin doesn't get complete coverage.
Correct.
All the people.
Correct. The Bezdin hasn't completely covered all the people, so it slipped through the crack that after they made their pronouncement on the property, which is now Mechosim Mishubadim, he still was able to do what he did, and the other part is considered Milva Baal Peh. So you have a situation where you have the property itself was pronounced in Bezdin as being owned by the Nigzal, but the property was still sold, and the poor fellow who bought it wouldn't know that it was in Bezdin because it never happened in Bezdin. So but to him,
one who sold it, it doesn't matter whether he knows Bezdin announced it or not. He can still go ahead. He finds a sucker on the,
right. But that sucker can no longer collect from an Nechosim Mishubadim. He can only collect from an Nechosim B'nei Chorin. Why? Because it's a milva ba'al peh. So in other words, we're splitting the baby here. We're saying that the land portion which was sold, everybody knew because Bezdin made an announcement. Once Bezdin makes an announcement, then it's public knowledge. It's no longer milva ba'al peh. It's milva b'shtar, and milva b'shtar you're allowed to collect nechosim mishuvadim. But for the poor fellow who bought the fruit, it's a milva ba'al peh. And milva ba'al peh, you can only collect b'nei chorin. But the Gemara has a kasha. The Gemara says, Yahachim, so he says, al ken v'lo b'din al peres. My piska, is there such a thing? Rashi says, well, my piska bitmiya. Where's the Rashi? My piska bitmiya. Piska tana lamilsa the ha'omer b'din eina omer ala peres. Is there such a thing that when you go before the Bezdin, that if you're already asking, they want the Bezdin to give you a decision on the Karen, that you're not getting it on the Paris. And for the Gemara, Stama de Milsa, Ki Tova Inish Karna Tova. Beresha, okay, so in other words, Ki Tova Inish Karna, that when a person comes and wants to collect the Karen, the Gemara says, Stama de Milsa, that the normal thing that they did, first he says, I want my land to be solid. Okay, so he's only focusing on the land, and the Bezdin isn't answering. It's almost lahavdil, like in our court system, the courts will, especially in the Supreme Court, okay, if you want to think of it that way, when you go before the court will answer your question, but not go laterally outside of what your question was. If you said, I have a piece of land, he stole it, the court will say, good, I'm giving you back the land. There's Paris, and that's the next step. They don't look at the next step because the next step wasn't in front of them. You understand? In other words, if it's not in front of them.
Wasn't part of the argument.
What?
wasn't part of the argument.
Wasn't part of the argument. That's exactly the point. So he says over here that that since it's not part of the argument, we're not going to rule on it. Because logic says if you're already there, take the whole case. Teretz is, he says, the Gemara says, Stama de Milsa ki tova inish karna tova beresha. He first comes with the land, and once he gets adjudication on the land, right? Then he goes to the next step. So there is the possibility that the land was adjudicated, the payers were not adjudicated. For the land, it's considered milva b'shtar, and you can collect b'nechosim mishubadim. But for the payers, since it's not b'shtar, it's a milva bal peh, and the halacha is milva bal peh, you can't collect b'nechosim mishubadim. Again, you understand, logic would dictate not like this. But the Gemara is painting scenarios for us to understand the hair that separates one from the other. That's the point here. The point is for us to understand. If it was that simple, okay, you go to Bezdin, you get the whole thing done, over. Teretz is, it's not so simple. That it seems like in those days, today you would say, if I come to Bezdin and I know my land was stolen and I have payers on the land, I have a taina on the payers at the same time that I have a taina on the land. That's what you would think would be the logic. So the Gemara is telling us, B'yama Mahem is manazeh. B'yama Mahem, they didn't do that. They went ahead, he said, stam in the mill. So first he says, let me protect my land. Then I'll worry about the payers. Once he comes to the payers, it's already too late. They were sold. If they were sold, now his only recourse is to nechasim b'nei chayrin. So we see the Gemara is thinking here. It's a little bit unusual, but nevertheless. So again, to wrap up, we still have been able through all of these different shitas, we have still been able to protect Rav Nachman and his view that in the case of a gazlan, where a person is collecting the peiros together with the keren, that appears to be ribis. And all these cases where the Gemara wanted to slug that up and wanted to say, but you see a case where they can collect and it's not considered ribis, the Gemara always differentiates and finds a different reason why you can collect it and still keep intact the principle that there's ribis if it appears that you're collecting on the stolen property. Because it's money, remember, Gemara wanted to say it's a balchov, even when it's not a balchov, it's a gazlan, according to Rava, according to Rabba, according to Rav Ashi, 3 scenarios where you can still collect and it's not considered ribis. Okay, we'll stop here. I wanted to get a little bit further to finally come to the conclusion and answer David's question when he said chazik ribis. So the Gemara next week will talk about chazik ribis, because remember, there's ribis and there's chazik ribis. There's just two different things. Halacha, something that is ribis, which is by the way, ribis is not midaraisa, ribis is midrabanan. So with the rabbanan crack down, and there's a case where if it's chazik ribis, then it's not really ribis, but yet we want to treat it like ribis. So again, we'll have to reach that mitzvah next week, so I just want to make, if anybody gets these OU emails that have articles and things, there's a link, and I'm happy to send it. There's a link that I just saw to a shiur that Rabbi Breidowitz gave for the OU in Eretz Yisrael. He's part of the OU lecture series. And in that, he talks about Hanukkah. And what's fascinating is the title of and I heard it last night, the title of the talk is the halachic evolution of the laws of Hanukkah. So Rabbi Breidowitz goes out of his way to make sure that we don't misunderstand the word evolution, because that would seem like the halachas, there's an evolution of the halachas, right? What was then is then, what is now, and that of course is totally not correct. So what he wants to explain, and it's a beautiful piece, it's about 45 minutes, is he talks about how Chazal emphasized certain halachas by Yom Mohaim, but those halachas became, I will say, not extinct, but they're not prevalent. It's not relevant as much today. So the underlying part of Hanukkah changed from what it was by Yom Mohaim. And just to understand it, by Yom Mohaim, the miracle of the oil of Hanukkah is not really what Hanukkah is about. And so that's the punchline, that we always talk about, the miracle of the lights. The miracle of the lights was never part of the discussion of Hanukkah by Yom Mohaim. It had nothing to do with it. Later on, when the underlying reasons, the victory of the Maccabeim, and then the Maccabeim themselves became the bad guys, as it were, right? Because the Malchus of Maccabee, which was improper, distorted the whole miracle of what was the conquest by the Maccabeim, right? Because the Maccabees were the good guys; they conquested, but then they overstepped their bounds, right? They were Levium, and they became kings, of which they had no right. So that quashed their legitimacy, if you will. So the Chachamim said, okay, that was the Nes, but since it turned out badly, we have to look for other reasons for the Nes Hanukkah, and therefore the Pach Shemen became the focal point of their reasoning. It's just a fascinating piece because it opens your eyes to thinking about what was the underlying part of Hanukkah and how the evolution, as he uses it, of Hanukkah kind of changed. The Pach Shemen was then also, it was a big thing, but it wasn't the Nes. That wasn't the Nes. The Nes was Rabban Bad Miatim, maybe Atahirim, etc. But later on, because of the change in what happened after and also he points out, again, for those who aren't as steeped in history, is that the story of Hanukkah is in the beginning of the war of the Maccabees with the Yevonim, and the war lasted another 25 years. It wasn't the end result of the war of Hanukkah where the Maccabeim were Menatzeach, where they were successful and found the oil, etc. That happened at the very beginning in the 3 years, the first 3 years of the conquest. The story of Hanukkah happened, and then Hanukkah, the whole battle continued 25 more years afterwards, unfortunately, to not such a great conclusion. So again, if you're interested, it's just something that I think most of us, if we, maybe we don't know, I didn't know a lot of this. So to me, it was fascinating to understand the depth of the history of Hanukkah and to understand what Hanukkah is. Because Hanukkah really is, it's not Midoraisa, it's not something, we say Hallel, we do all of those things, but, like Purim, it's not one of the main Yom Tovim. So there's a lot of history with it. And it's a fascinating discussion. So we're in the middle of Hanukkah. I just wanted to, give you a little bit of a taste of maybe something that you might be interested in. And we should all have a freilich and lichtliche Hanukkah. And the good news is that the Rabbeinu Shalom has given us the opportunity, now that we're suffering through COVID, to have perhaps a Bibi Menatzeach. Maybe it's one of the great nisim is that we have a vaccine and people can protect themselves, and hopefully that will be the real protector. The Rabbeinu Shalom, remember, it's all beyond the Rabbeinu Shalom. We work hard, scientists work hard, but it's the beyond Rabbeinu Shalom that this whole thing happens. So we should all be zeicher that through Hanukkah and the beginning of the Nes, we should all have a hatzlacha. We should all be healthy and well. And Mirz Hashem, weiter next week we'll pick up and try to finish the sukya and move on.
Amen.
FYI, Chaim posted the link to the rabbi's share.
You did? You have that link?
Yeah, he posted it to the chat.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you very much. It's very worthwhile to listen to that share. Yasher koach, a freilich Chanukah to everybody.
Thank you.